Hi, everybody. If you could just, since it might be a smaller group this time, just take a second to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from.
Hello, I guess I'll go first. My name is Odalis Gaitan, and this is actually my 4th day here at KUNC. So I'm really excited to meet all of you.
You're at KUNC, did you say, in Northern Colorado? Cool.
Yes.
Awesome.
Well, at least what's
Those
your
of you who have newly joined, we're just taking a moment to introduce ourselves. I don't think we've got a large panel today and maybe fewer participants live. So Terry and Tasha and Jennifer and Carly and JMR, if you guys want to introduce yourselves, that would be great.
All right, I'm Terry Sheridan. I'm the Senior Director of News and Education at WSHU Public Radio in Connecticut.
I'm Jessica Maria Ross. I've got bronchitis, so I'm going to be pretty quiet today. I'm the Senior Community Engagement Strategist at CAP Radio, the NPR affiliate in Northern California, serving the Central Valley, and a super fan of America Amplified and on the advisory board.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tasha Gibson. I'm with WFYI Public Media in Indianapolis. Really glad to be here.
I'm Carly Berlin. I'm a reporter with WWNO in New Orleans. Relatively new here, and I'm just excited to dig in more to community engagement.
And I am Jennifer Pemberton. I'm the Vice President for News at KTOO, which is the public media station in Juneau, Alaska.
Shane, it's your turn.
Oh, I'm Shane Nuesca, and I work with Jennifer at KTOO.
All right. We're going to give it a few more minutes. So multitask, answer your emails, respond to texts, discipline your children, walk your dog. Give it a few more minutes. Hi there, Katie and Rima. If you're just joining us, please take a moment to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from.
Hi, Rima Dial, WSHU Public Radio General Manager, Fairfield, Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist over at Montana Public Radio.
Nice, Katie, welcome.
Thanks.
And Catherine.
Hi, are we introducing ourselves? I just popped in. Okay. I'm Catherine Comp, the Content Director at Blue Ridge Public Radio in Western North Carolina.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you, all of us, for coming and joining us in this webinar today. It's super exciting from my point of view, as always, to see all of us come together and talk about this stuff and figure out how to do it, and to know that we're doing it, you know, from Montana to Connecticut, from New Orleans to Greeley. And, you know, I think the folks at KPCC need to understand that they've been a huge inspiration to the rest of us in the public media system, and we're trying to figure out how to do it as well as you do it. So this webinar is going to be walking you through kind of how a couple of stations have figured out how to translate engagement into content. And, you know, we all know what that means. And I think, you know, a couple months ago, I think Jennifer and Shane were saying, how do we do this? How do we do this? And then they did it. And then they were like, okay, this isn't brain surgery. We can do this. But it's still really good to hear, I think, some real, you know, concrete examples of how it went and what worked and what didn't work. And so we're going to let Brianna Lee, who is the engagement producer for Civics and Democracy at KPCC, but before that she was the engagement producer for College Pathways. Maybe Brianna give us a wave. We got a lot of people here, and she's working with Jill Replogle, who is the College Pathways reporter for KPCC. And just full disclosure, Jill and I worked together on Fronteras for 3 or 4 years ago. So we're old buddies. So we're going to start with them, and then we're going to move on to WFYI's team at SideEffects. Christine Herman is the managing editor of SideEffects, and Brittani Howell is the engagement specialist with SideEffects Public Media, which is based at WFYI in Indianapolis. So Jill and Brianna, take it away, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I'm gonna let Bree start and give a little background on kind of, well, actually, I'll just tell you. So College Pathways might not be a super intuitive name for this beat, but essentially KPCC got a grant to really focus on the kind of interim between high school and college, and how students get to college and who gets to college and who doesn't, and where the inequities there, and what are some people doing to kind of fix that. So that was like the impetus for my beat, and we really built this beat from scratch, going through a design process that Bree can talk about.
Yeah, so basically going into this, Jill and I it was a very unformed beat. We didn't know what the parameters were. We didn't really know exactly what we were going to be reporting on. So a lot of our job was to figure out what the shape of this was going to look like. Also, Jill and I had not reported on education before. We were very new to the education beat in general. So we were basically starting with nothing. And so the first step was to figure out what this beat was going to be all about. So we did this process called human-centered design. And if you're not familiar with that, it's basically just using a sort of product thinking mindset and applying it to journalism. So what it involves is doing a lot of interviews with stakeholders. So people who have some kind of stake in this sort of college pathways, whatever our idea of it was. So first we had to sort of map out, like, who are the people who have a stake in this beat. So it's prospective college students, it's people who maybe they did not go to college and they're older adults and they're looking to go back. It's people who decided not to go to college because financial situation didn't really allow them to, or for other reasons. People who had a lot of debt after coming to college. So we kind of just spend a lot of time brainstorming, like, okay, who are all the possible people that might have a stake in some of this reporting that we might be doing, and we let it be as broad as possible. And then over time, we sort of whittled it down, and we decided on, I think it was like somewhere between 10 and 12 different kinds of characteristics of people that we wanted to hear from. And then we had to find those people. So we had to I think we ended up finding, we have a long list that we can share. There's a report that I think is in the handout that you're all going to see, where we describe exactly like all the people that we found. But it was everything from, somebody who had a learning disability who, had gone through college and could talk to us about what that was like. Somebody who was an undocumented student and, telling us about that process. Somebody who had not gone to a traditional four-year college, but went to a trade school, a trade program. So we interviewed all these people. They were hour-long interviews that we conducted over the course of a couple of weeks, I believe. And the purpose of these interviews was not really to get anything like that specific. Like, we didn't have like very pointed questions. Our questions were mostly just like, what was some of the information needs that you had while you were going to school? Tell us a little bit about your journey. Tell us about the things that keep you up at night. And like, we intentionally left these questions pretty vague and just let them talk about their lives and talk about, how education was for them, how they thought about education, and then sort of like we're able to draw out, they call it explicit and implicit needs. Explicit needs just being like, I needed, financial aid to get through school. Implicit needs being more underneath the surface, like things that they sort of indicated that they needed. And so through this whole process, we were able to find sort of overlaps between these very, very different interviews that we had and figure out common themes. And then from there, that sort of told us where the needs were among these stakeholders, and we were able to shape our beat around that. So really from the get-go, this engagement process like helped us figure out exactly how we wanted to focus this beat. And I think it was really illuminating in that, like, before we started on this process, we had a lot of assumptions about what college pathways could mean, right? At the time, it was sort of early pandemic, and a lot of people were, there was a lot of talk about, people just like not going to college because they had to work, about, whether or not they would go back to school. A lot of losses at the K-12 level in terms of like learning opportunities. And I think where we came out of this was that we found that there was really a gap in resources among older students as well, people who were not currently in a school environment where they could have access to a counselor or, have other people around them even just talk about higher education, where they just really had to figure out like, okay, I'm an adult, I'm in a job that I may or may not be satisfied with, and I want to go back to school, but I don't really know how to like navigate that whole process, and I don't even know who to go to for help. So that really, this human-centered design process really solidified, this opportunity that we could focus on older adults who were just not having much access to information about higher education. So that was like sort of the big light bulb moment that kicked off this whole thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say like, so one of the probably biggest things that came out of this was kind of what we weren't going to focus on, and so that has helped shape content for the past 2 years, the kind of stories that I'm not going to do and the kind of stories that I am going to do. And one of the great things about that process was just to hear directly from students on what they wanted to know and what they needed. And so a bunch of stories came out of that. For example, a lot of the students talked about wanting kind of alternatives to like a typical 4-year degree, right? And so I did a story about certificate programs and boot camps and how to know what is worth your time and what isn't worth your time. And actually one of the people that we interviewed for that initial process ended up being kind of the main character in that story, because she had come from Iran and she needed to start a new career and she had no idea where, she's like, it's got to be fast. And so she spent a ton of money doing all these like crappy programs online. And so she was kind of like my, like test, I don't know, what do you call it? Anyway, she was my main character in the story and kind of how to know what's worth your time and what isn't. I did like a whole apprenticeship series out of that also, out of just this idea that people were looking for alternatives to 4-year college. And then we really, one of the other kind of main takeaways from that research process was that people wanted to see a clear connection between education and a career. And so, so we did a lot of kind of focusing on that. And so one of the, I think was it the first one, Bri? I think kind of engagement activity that we did after that was, well, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't the first, but the second, I believe, was a live chat on how to start a new career. And so it was a little, it was kind of like we had some of the speakers that we had tied education into that. And some of them were really kind of more focused on like the workforce side of things. But that was, we got a lot of great traffic out of that. We also had like multiple parts of that. So just in terms of like content, we, and these are also in the handout, but we had a kind of like a pre-story that advertised this thing that we are going to do. But I also talked to the people that were going to be doing this live event and had them, give some tips from the beginning. And so we had a pre-story that was actually like a fully fledged, satisfying story that had good information for people that also promoted this event we were doing. Out of the live event, we did a recap of that event. We did a story that lives on our website that was a recap of that event, plus the video of the event that was on there. And then, and we also, leading up to that event, had done a type form, which I don't, is everybody familiar with what that is? It's essentially, I don't know, Bree, can you explain what type form is?
It's just an open form that anybody can fill out. We were just asking people, what questions do you have about, what you need in order to change careers, start a new career from wherever you are now. And so that informed the parameters of our event, because it was a live sort of Q&A event. So what do you need to know about what kind of education you need to start a new career? Are you interested, or what kinds of careers do you think even fit you, and what resources do you need in order to figure that out? So we just had an open form that we distributed through social media channels. We mentioned it on air, and then we had it embedded in a couple of stories, and we got a lot of questions actually about, people were very interested in having different questions answered about that. And we use that to inform the event, and also just to kind of give us an idea about what people wanted to know.
Right. And then further stories came out of that. I mean, some of the people who asked questions in that initial type form ended up being characters in stories that I did after that. There was one woman who couldn't get financial aid. And actually, this was sort of like a tangential piece of information that she had written in about, but she was an older student who was going back to school during the pandemic, had never gone to college. And in California, it's really hard to get state financial aid as an older student. And I had, followed up with her and talked to her on the phone a couple of times. And, that was like I kept kind of I had her in the back of my mind as somebody that I might want to use for a story. And then the state changed its rules around financial aid and opened it up to people like her. And she was like the perfect person to call for this story. So, in some of these cases, the payoff was much further down the line, but just having those people kind of in the queue, already having a relationship with them really paid off in the future for doing stories. And I'll let Bree talk about a couple of things we did, but just kind of also following up from that, I had a couple of the students that we interviewed for that very first beat design ended up being in a series that I just did a couple weeks ago on, we titled it Hidden Curriculum, but it's basically a series of student voices, students who face kind of particular barriers to getting to higher education. I'll put it in the chat. And some of those initial students that I talked to ended up being characters in this story and telling a lot of what they had told me kind of as this background research, but for the public. So, that was 2 years after we did that initial research, but I was like, oh yeah, there's that one student who is perfect for this story. And so we've had two or three of the students in that have ended up kind of in stories. Do you want to talk a little bit about the listening sessions we've done, Bree, and other stuff?
Yeah, well, I was going to talk about the guide also.
Okay. Yeah.
Also, so sort of in parallel, while Jill was working on some of these stories that kind of came out of the initial beat design process about, focusing on people and their questions about careers and highlighting different kind of career paths and the education required to get them. There was another thing that we were working on, which was basically just writing a guide to higher education in California. And mainly the reason that we decided to write a guide was because it was a requirement of the grant that gave us this beat. That was sort of the main reason, but it actually ended up leading to quite a lot of other things. So we had no real specific instructions for how to go about this guide, but just based on what we had heard from different people during those human-centered design research process, was that there were people in so many different kinds of circumstances and backgrounds, and they needed sort of tailored information for their circumstance. Getting to higher education as somebody who might have had all their previous education in a different country, that's very different set of advice than somebody who is, trying to get to higher education, but maybe they're unhoused, completely different sets of resources, completely different sets of advice and tips and places to find information. So we had a section that was basically just breaking out the, specific resources for if you are in a particular situation. If you are a parent of a young child, here's all of the things that you can look at to determine which places will offer childcare and at what kind of price, for example. So in order to put that put that, those lists of resources together, I had to call quite a few people who were sort of experts in all these like very different situations. So I think that's when we got to hear a lot from people who had experienced these things directly. What was it like to go through college and also have young children and navigate childcare? What was it like to, figure out what your financial aid situation was going to be like if you're undocumented? And what was it like, what was the landscape out there for like housing for unhoused students, for example? So I think from there, we just realized that, it was really hard for anybody to get information just by Googling, or, just like there's no public information was really hard to come by because the situations were so unique and so different. And really the best information came from people who'd gone through it themselves. And so we knew that we wanted to put a project together that, featured students and their voices like very prominently. And so I think the idea started to form that we should have students just talk about how they were able to navigate, these very different things, and what barriers they came across and how they ended up finding information and what it took for them to figure out the things that nobody tells you about higher education. So that really fed into that idea, which came to fruition and launched just a couple of weeks ago, and it's great. So yeah, that's sort of another thread that happened.
And, some of those contacts, and I understand that it's pretty luxurious that there are two of us, that there were two of us kind of working on this for a long time. But, Bree was able to pass contacts off to me from people she talked to and story ideas from people she talked to. And so, for example, she talked to a woman who's blind who actually got in touch with you because of the guide, right?
I got in touch with her for the section about like what to know if you are, if you have a disability, like what kind of resources are out there. And I got in touch with a nonprofit who was like, you should talk to our youth leader. She went through this process herself and she has a lot of stories to tell. And and that was a great conversation. Yeah.
So then she ended up being the main character in a story that we published a couple of weeks ago. So there's a lot of like synergy and kind of just trying to get as much as you can out of the engagement work that you do. And, the college guide, Bree put a ton of work into it, and but it lives on our website in multiple formats, and we've been able to republish parts of it that are very specific. And so that gets its own traffic. I think you've done radio stuff too, right, Bree?
I did a couple of radio things on it. And we also offered like physical print versions of the guide that we had been distributing to libraries and like nonprofits and basically anybody who requested a copy. We're actually out of many of our copies now. I understand. I know it's like a couple thousand that were requested already, which I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, okay. So, and we did multiple languages too. So we have English, Spanish, simplified Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Oh,
I was gonna say, someone said, can you steal all these ideas? Absolutely. I just want to put in the chat here a link to someone who got in touch with us, and Bree, you probably remember better how this was, but we had a conversation with a woman from EdSurge who wanted to do something similar to what we did with the beat design, and they published it. I mean, we also published ours, but it wasn't really a news story. But they published all of the information that they got from these students that they interviewed, which I think is fine and great. And, I always kind of thought we should have done that to begin with, but we sort of did just a little bit further down the road.
So we're getting some questions. I'm happy to read them. Jill, Jennifer asks, is College Pathways your only beat? How much longer do you expect to focus on this? Do you think it will always be a beat at KPCC or morph into something else?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I wish I knew. I think our, if you work in public radio, you know that grants come and go, and I think our grant is up. So I don't know if I'm going to continue focusing on it. I think it could continue to be a focus, especially in this kind of intersection between education and the economy, which is where I really tried to focus during the pandemic. But I like at this particular point, I honestly don't know if it's going to continue.
And Reema's question, what kind of support do you guys get? Editorial, marketing, digital?
Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to talk, Bree?
Well, I think we had a lot of support from other people around the newsroom. So in terms of, I mean, digital, so I used to be on the digital team. So like the digital support was like me, and like knowing how like that team works and sort of what we need to do in order to, you know, make collaboration like really seamless. Marketing support, yes, we have a small marketing team, and they were able to, you know, help us with some ads behind the guide itself. Who created the college guide? It was me. And so like I just took care of all the editorial stuff and the like writing and publishing and everything. And then Jill helped a lot with the editing and shaping of it too.
But that link that I put in the chat, which is similar to what Bree and I did, that was one person, I'm pretty sure. Rebecca, I think she did that whole thing. So it is doable. It just, you know, it just might take longer.
And I think a lot of the stuff that we were doing on the college pathways, we had a lot of support from, so, you know, my supervisor on the engagement team gave us a lot of support for that. So whatever resources we need in terms of like, you know, getting help from other people on the engagement team to reach out to people, to kind of like keep track of contacts, we were able to utilize some of that also.
We did, I can't remember if you mentioned this or not, Bree, but we did have an outside consultant that helped us with the human-centered design process, because we didn't know anything about it at the beginning. Now I feel like I could do it, and I could teach it to anyone here who wants to do it. I mean, it's not brain surgery. And I think there are ways to do it that are scaled down and not as intense as what we did.
We are thinking about bringing in some people who are experts in human-centered design to take you all through that exercise. If you're interested, just let us know. Rima asks, what does the grant pay for?
I mean, I think it paid for both of our positions. I've been told I'm not getting fired even though the grant finished, but yeah.
But a good chunk of it was allocated for prints, for print, like physical print materials too. I think there was a point where we were like, oh, we have thousands of dollars we need to spend on printing for things. We better figure out how to spend it, which is why we had so many print copies like available. And then translation, we had a certain segment of the budget earmarked for translation. Originally, there was some travel budget that was set aside, but we didn't really use any of it, obviously, because pandemic reasons. So I think that had to be reallocated. I don't remember what else specifically.
Mark, so do you guys think you could do something like this in your newsrooms?
One of the things I wanted to ask about was, I feel like sometimes my newsroom editorially sort of psychs itself out before stuff gets off the launch pad. And like an example of this was, we were talking about, you know, the shooting, which is obviously top of mind. And we're talking about sort of gun culture and all these other sorts of things. But the conversation sort of faded, I think, when the question got asked, well, so what are the takeaways going to be like for the reader, listener, viewer, when we try to do this story? So I wondered if you could sort of talk about going from your listening sessions and bridging that gap, and maybe having some uncertainty going into the listening sessions, what you're going to have to try to convince folks that are so used to sort of having the narrative kind of already defined in some ways, at least those takeaways defined in some ways, because I feel like that's a stumbling block that I'm running into.
So who has those takeaways already defined?
I think the editors want to have it like they're saying, oh, okay, so you're pitching this story to us. What are the takeaways? And it feels like with the engagement stuff, right, you're sort of having these listening sessions. It's a learning process and you don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So I'm just wondering if you've ever encountered this, or if you have a way to sort of break through some of those cultural barriers. Organizational barriers.
I think for us, like, it wasn't, we didn't frame it expecting to come out with like, specific takeaways or to match, like assumptions that we'd had going into it. I think, so we had a listening session early on. So in addition to it was individual interviews we did during the beat design process, we had a listening session among people who were working at the intersection of education and employment. So a lot of people who were working at like job centers, a lot of people who ran nonprofits that, helped people navigate either education or careers. We had a couple of community college counselors involved in that, workforce development people. We've kind of got them all into one virtual room and sort of just talked about what their challenges were and like what they were, sort of dealing with on a regular basis. And I think, it's, I think I think what helped a lot between that and like the, the stakeholder interviews that we had early on was that, we were able to write for specific experiences afterwards. I think that's something that was really helpful, where it was like when I was trying to figure out like, okay, what information would be helpful in a guide for somebody, I could think of like somebody specific that we had talked to and being like, oh yeah, they had a lot of needs around like XYZ, and like they would probably benefit from information around this. And I think that was helpful to be able to write for like a person that I knew whose needs were probably, resonating for, people who were in their similar situation. And then I think like, after the listening sessions, we kind of just do a debrief about like, what are assumptions that we had that were either confirmed or challenged by the conversations that the people that we heard from. And I think it helps just to frame, our approaches to stories going forward, and to figure out like, did we like the kind of thing that we were going to write, would it have resonated with this group of people or would it not have? And like, like discussing why, like, go forward with certain approaches. I think that's kind of more how we go about it. So yeah, I don't know, Jill, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, well, so KPCC had done something similar, but it was actually like already, in the middle of a beat that was well established, the early childhood beat, and they did a human-centered design thing. And Kristen Muller, I don't know what her title is now, VP of something or other, content, she was convinced that they were gonna, she always tells the story that she was convinced that they were gonna write like a childcare guide or something out of it.
Yelp for childcare.
Yeah, Yelp for childcare. She was convinced that this was going to be the thing that everybody wanted. And she was proven totally wrong. And I think that kind of like converted her to this whole process. Because we do have journalists tend to have a lot of assumptions about what we think people want and need. And I think, for me, I've been a reporter for a long time, and I'm totally sold by the process, because there's just like so many things that I learned just kind of listening to people in a way that wasn't on deadline and that wasn't for a specific story. And I think that, the editors that have gone through this process with their reporters have also realized that, but you kind of gotta, like, I think that was really smart, where you gotta like compare what you thought going into it and what you learned going out of it. And that's a good way to see if your assumptions were correct.
I think that's great. There's more we can talk about here, but let's hear what SideEffects has to tell us about translating engagement into journalism, and then hopefully we can open it up and questions can come fast and furious. Thanks, Jill and Brianna, that was great.
Yes, thank you guys so much. And thank you, Elisa, for bringing it over to us. I loved hearing everything that Brianna and Jill had going on. And I think a lot of what we're going to say is just going to kind of yes and what you guys have been working on. So on our handout, we kind of just listed 2 examples of engagement, I guess, projects or results that we've had. The second one I think is going to be a lot more interesting to talk about, but I'm going to get through the first one kind of quickly. So a lot of what we think about at SideEffects when it comes to engagement is just asking people, like, what do you need to know, or what do you want to know? I'm going to be honest, I took my cue very much from Ashley Alvarado over at KPCC, whose like sort of definition of engagement is like, what do people need to be their own best advocates? And so just kind of posing the question to your audience and then believing them when they articulate it. So we had a text tool called the Midwest Checkup that we used a lot during the pandemic to like solicit questions from the audience, like, hey, there's this kind of big global health crisis going on. What do you want to know about it? And then like trying to fill in gaps that people indicated to us, people being like everything from like, I don't know if I trust vaccines, to what exactly are these contact tracers doing with our information, to very like practical things like, I have this condition, can I get a vaccine? Or like, how do I get tested? And like, we could help them with some like general literature, but also like if I had their address, I could get as granular as like, this is your testing facility. This is what you need to take. They're open from this time to this time. So that was pretty cool. Every now and then we got really good questions. And when we got questions, basically I would keep an eye out for big themes and sort of like sort questions into buckets. And we could do Q&As, which, you know, were published like articles on the website that tackled all of them. And then we would put them on the website so they existed for anybody to see. And then we would text them back to the group overall to say, like, these are the questions we received from you. These are the answers we created for you. Here it is. Keep them coming. And sometimes we got questions that warranted maybe something a little more. So at one point we asked a question like, you know, we talked a lot about the pandemic and just a lot of different angles of the pandemic. Today, we're going to talk about like maternal health. Do you have any questions around like the way this is affecting like moms and kids? And someone texted back. Only 2 people texted back to that one, but this was one of them. And this person said, I would like to know how the pandemic is affecting like child development in the long run. Do we have any idea what like the effect of like kids not getting to be in daycare right now is, of them not getting to like watch people's mouths as they're talking, like that kind of stuff. And so I put that to the SideEffects reporter group and just said, does anybody want to take a crack at that? And Christine actually grabbed it. So I'm going to let Christine talk about why she thought it was interesting and worth turning into more than just like basically like a question we asked an expert and then texted directly back, why she thought it was worth turning into something we could publish.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Christine Herman. I'm the managing editor of SideEffects. And yeah, but a year ago, I was actually a reporter at one of our partner stations, WILL in Illinois. Yeah, so when I saw this question, I mean, I just thought it was a really interesting question and wanted to look into it. And it was pretty straightforward. I just talked to like a child development person and a language development person and just had kind of a back and forth about what, you know, kind of getting at this question that came in through the text line, but then also adding in other questions that would make it kind of flesh out the issue for people who might have other related questions about this topic. So again, like pretty straightforward, but we were able to use it as an opportunity to also like show back to our audience, like, look, like we want to be answering your questions on the air. We can say like, if you have a question, you can text us and, you know, we can plug the text line. So and then also at my station, like separate from SideEffects, we were also getting in questions from people through our separate thing. And I just wanted to kind of elaborate on something Brittany said. Sometimes it's like really overwhelming to get all these questions like, oh, I have to go interview like 5 people to answer these 5 different questions or something. But what we did at my former station was we actually just like, if NPR had a really great write-up of something, we would just point people to that. Or, you know, like there's no need to like rehash or reinvent the wheel. We would also pull on other people's reporting and just give credit. Like, well, the Chicago Tribune reported this and it answers this question. And those types of posts, especially during the pandemic, got a ton of traffic. And they weren't that huge of a lift if you know, you can do original reporting, of course, but you can also draw on other people's work. And it's still a service to the audience because they had a question and then here we're getting it answered and then delivering it back. And a lot of these questions too, if they're very common questions that people had, I think they got a lot of traffic too, because they sort of matched a lot of keywords in like search. So yeah, so that I'll throw it back to Brittany so she can kind of jump into the second example of engagement that we have to talk about.
Yeah. So the second example that I have is a lot like the design or the human-centered design process that KPCC went through to design the beat that they were just talking about. Basically, the way this came about was one of our reporters, her name is Darian Benson, she said a couple of months ago, I would really like to do some concentrated work around the topic of like addiction. And so she let us know well in advance of when she wanted to start working on stories. So, and she had other stories she was working on in the meantime. So this did not like bog her down at all. So she indicated interest. And what I did was I started setting up listening sessions. And for us, like a listening session is an on background group conversation with experts with like professional experience in the area, with people with lived experience. In this particular situation, it ended up being a mix of both because in the recovery community. A lot of the people who are now working on the issue have lived experience of the issue. And so what we did was we had 3 to 4 listening sessions with about 25 people all in all sprinkled throughout. They were an hour long. We had a set list of questions for each group, and we split into small groups of like 4 to 5 people tops in each one. So that gave us like an hour in which to have a nice tight conversation with a small group, so you could get into a lot of like nitty-gritty details. They were guided by a reporter and then another reporter who was taking notes, with the expectation that all of this was just on background. And we would pitch the questions to them and then just like let them run with the conversation. And the fun thing about putting people with lived experiences or similar professional experiences in a group together is that they'll just start talking, and then you just get to be a fly on the wall, and you sometimes learn a lot more than any of the questions that you wrote down. You get to find out all these things that maybe you didn't consider looking into. And like Bree was saying, you want to keep your questions kind of big and open-ended to really let people gravitate toward the thing that is most on their mind, because if you make it too narrow, you might accidentally steer the conversation away from something really juicy. But letting them like talk to each other really helped find those things that we were missing. After we did all of our listening sessions, we had a debrief with the group. We're all virtual and we're all in different states, so it's easier to do things online. So we did a Google Jamboard, which is a free Google tool. It's basically like a sticky note exercise. And we all just sort of like blasted out the things that stuck out to us most from our individual small groups. And we grouped the notes based on like sort of like themes. So like a group over here for stigma, a group over here for barriers, a group over here for like the importance of community. And by going through it all together, we were sort of able to have those conversations of like, where are the stories, where are the pain points, where are the gaps that we could fill, or the things that we could highlight that aren't being highlighted. Another thing we've asked a lot was like, what's the media missing? What does the media get wrong? Like, when we are covering this, like what is helpful and what's damaging? How do we not do the damaging thing? So more than just like what stories are we covering, we came out of these with a better idea of like how to cover the issue overall, and like what to do as we find those individual stories to tackle. So I'm gonna let Christine cover sort of the editorial side of things, but it was really exciting. I'll just say we did these for Darien, but we had all the reporters pitch in as moderators, and as we were going through, Darien had plenty of ideas, and so did everybody else.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of elaborate on that for a bit. I mean, the benefit of getting all these people in a room at a time, there's a lot of work on the front end to like cast a wide net and invite lots of people and schedule it and then show up and do it. But then what we came out of it with was just pages and pages of notes. So I think of listening sessions as like on background interviews on steroids, just like you can do these one-off with each person. But there is something really special that happens when you get these people in a room together. They like share, they kind of like bounce off each other's energy. And I think from an editorial standpoint, I think there was a question about like, how do you like sell this to your newsroom or if your news director is not supportive, or if it's not like the culture is not there to be like, yes, take a week to like do a listening session before you have any idea what you're going to report on. It's like you're guaranteed to come away with way more ideas than you can possibly follow up on when you do this. Take this kind of approach, because you're bombarded with all this great information. You're going to learn a lot, and then now you've got also this great group of people that know who you are. So if you reach out to them and you want to follow up with them about this thing or that thing, they might be a potential source. They might be a potential connector for you to other sources. So, and then also as an editor, I feel a lot more confident to be like, yes, we need to talk about transportation as a barrier, because out of like the 15 people in that one group, like 12 of them were like, yes, this is the #1 issue that we see. like, oh, okay, instead of reporters being like, I think I'll look into transportation as a barrier. And I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds good. It's like, no, you absolutely should report on that, because that was a very powerful theme that emerged from this group that we brought together with all this shared wisdom. So like, go forth with confidence that this is something that really needs attention. You know, I think there was a question earlier about like, what were some assumptions you made that were challenged? That's the other really nice thing about this. I think I went in thinking like, oh, we need to do a lot more like reporting on all the problems and how bad it is and raise awareness. And a lot of people were like, we would love to see more stories about the progress that's being made. It's not perfect. It's actually really dire, but there is actually a lot of good forward momentum, like a lot of good solutions being explored, maybe on a small scale here or there. And, you know, the idea of doing solutions focused reporting, especially on a topic like this, I think people are craving that too. Like I see a headline where like, you know, overdoses are up. It's like, I know everything I need to know from just reading that headline. I don't know if I'm gonna go read that story, but if it's like, oh, one county found a way to overcome transportation barriers, you know, and save lives, it's like, oh, this is fast. You know, I think there's an appetite for that. And also that's what people told us that they would love to see more of from reporters, is focus on where there is progress being made. They also were like, you know, we would love to see more examples of people, characters in these stories that are non-chaotic drug users, because so many people who have a chemical dependence or an addiction, their lives actually look very normal. But we only hear about like the people whose lives are totally destroyed, you know, or something like that. And at first I was like, I can't wrap my brain around this. And I asked a bunch of questions and we had a really great dialogue about this point. And I'm like, that's so interesting. So anyways, those are just some examples. And I think that if you do this, take this type of approach, I think, you know, if you get support from a newsroom to do it, like, I don't know, I think you're kind of guaranteed a payoff in terms of like product, content, stories, and all of that. It's kind of hard not to come away from a conversations like these with like way more possible story ideas than you can even possibly navigate.
All right, this has been so great. I would love to open it up to questions, especially, you know, Carly and Katie and Odalise, you guys are kind of new to this engagement game and you're in smaller newsrooms. What questions, how can we do this with one person? Yeah, that's a question I have. I'm the only engagement producer at my station. There's 2 reporters and me. And I also have to produce content. How can I do this?
Can I first answer Rima's question in the chat? Do you mind?
Yeah.
What are mistakes that we can learn from? I just like thought of 2 things. I mean, just like on the listening sessions, I do feel like those are super useful. I always feel like they're too short and we don't actually like get to the meat of what, I don't know. I just feel like we don't get to the meat of it. So I would honestly, I'd like to see longer listening sessions. Maybe there's fewer people, but the couple that I've done, there's a lot of people and you kind of can only get so far, and it seems like there needs to be more time. The other thing is, and this goes a little bit to Mark, what your kind of dilemma, I think at the beginning, I did some stories. I mean, I think honestly, like a lot of the stuff that we've done you could probably call utility journalism. And, you know, like the LA Times has like a whole utility journalism team, which is like, this is what you need to know about these things. But we have learned that people want that stuff. They want practical information. It's, you know, it's like the hierarchy of needs. People needed to know where to get a booster shot, for example. So, you know, we did end up doing a lot of practical stuff like that. But I think at first I actually did 2 versions of some stories where I did one that was supposed to be like the practical guide. And then I did another that was like more what I thought of as traditional journalism. And that was just kind of silly in the end. and I have like, it's taken a while, but I have been working to like combine those 2 things. You can do a story that is good. And I don't know if traditional journalism is the right word, but like that is a news story that, you know, your editors might expect, but that also has like good practical information, people, and solutions to Brittany's point and Christine's point. Like you can focus your story on solutions and still make it a good story.
Well, and I'll just add too that I think that that's such a great case for like thinking about different audiences needing different versions of the story. So like your nuts and bolts story probably plays really well with a web audience, whereas like your audio audience is going to need something more narrative than that. Like, so those stories I think shouldn't look the same. I know it feels like extra work to do multiple versions of the story, but if you're really thinking about what the audience needs, there could be multiple versions, or you just say like, hey, we're only doing nuts and bolts stories and they're only going on the web.
Or you could have, sorry, Bree.
Oh, you go ahead.
I'll keep it short. Or you could have like multiple elements in a story. So like you've got your narrative, but you've got your nuts and bolts like right alongside it. So for example, Christine and I and our team are wrapping up a story on the way that alcohol use really went up during the pandemic and alcohol deaths really went up during the pandemic. The reporter partly did this because the people in our listening session were pointing out like opioids get so stigmatized. Alcohol is incredibly deadly and no one is talking about it the same way. It doesn't get stigmatized the same way. So Natalie looked into the rising rates just to say like, oh, this is a big thing we should be keeping an eye on. And so like the story is communicating the numbers and like the overall context, but we've got a sidebar because we didn't want this to just be like a gloom and doom, this is a really bad thing. Because in the listening sessions, we heard that a lot of people can have like non-chaotic use and maybe like are using to the point where it's maybe like a problem, but not a problem that like manifests in them like needing to go to recovery. It doesn't look at like the full train wreck that a lot of people associate with like substance use. We're including a sidebar of like, if you think your relationship with alcohol might need examination, here's like a kind of a questionnaire to do some self-reflection. Like, here's how to start thinking about it in your own life so that you can figure out like if your relationship is healthy or whether you need to go like take another step. I don't think that's a thing that we're going to end up in the radio piece, but we really wanted it to be in the digital piece so that people know that it's there and that they have like a next step to take.
Carly has a question.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of engagement reporting in my prior role in the nonprofit media world at Southerly, and I'm curious just to hear about the sort of internal systems you have to keep track of responses you're getting, and then kind of deciding where to prioritize, kind of catalyzing from there for coverage.
Key question.
I spend more time in like Google Sheets than I ever thought possible. So when we were getting like a ton of questions in, I had like a Google Sheet where I would dump all of the questions. And if I thought it was something that like I could answer myself, that I knew of a good NPR piece or I knew of like a good local resource that I could like take and send back to them and be just like, I filled the information gap. I would sort of like mark it green in the sheet along with like the answer that I wrote down. And if I saw big emerging themes, I would take those questions and sort of group them elsewhere. And those, I'm going to use contact tracing because that was a big one. We had a lot of questions about like, what is this being used for? What are we supposed to do? How do I know this is legal, or what is HIPAA? All the things. I grouped them all in like one area, and we turned all of those into a Facebook Live conversation. But like we focused on that as a topic overall because all of those questions were coming in and they were all related like that. So yeah, Google Sheets, and then slacking about it incessantly, just being like, hey, we're doing this Facebook Live because it's an emerging need, or like, hey, this question's come up a couple of times in different ways through our various engagement tools. Is there a reporter who would be interested in tackling it?
Yeah, I think for us, we use Airtable a lot. I don't know how familiar you are with Airtable, but it's basically just like super fancy Google Sheets. It's got like a lot of ability to like cross-link tables and everything. We're definitely using it for the Civics and Democracy program that I'm on right now, where we're collecting a lot of voter questions and getting having to categorize it by like different kinds of themes and figuring out, okay, like, is this question warrant like a separate web post on its own? Does it warrant like something for broadcast? And so for College Pathways, though, I think a lot of it, like we would keep track of everything on our own Airtable also, but Jill and I spoke so often that we usually kept up with it just kind of verbally. So yeah.
Do we want to circle back to that question about small newsrooms or?
Yeah, that's, yeah.
I mean, my former station, I was one of 3 reporters, or at one point we had 5, then we lost 2 people, we're down to 3. So like doing engagement, I think I was lucky that my news director, like that it kind of came from the top, like as a priority. Well, one, I'm part of SideEffects, so I got to be part of this regional team where engagement was really baked in. But I think my advice for like, if you don't have like a community engagement specialist, but you want to be doing this sort of thing, I think like if you start with a conversation with your editor about like why you want to kind of have some time dedicated to just intentional listening, whether it's showing up in, various, community organizations in your area to just be there, listen, introduce yourself without a set agenda or story, but you like explain to them why this, would be good for you to build expertise, knowledge, make connections, build your beat, and ultimately probably very likely lead to better quality stories down the road. Like, I think I can't imagine that there'd be a news director or an editor who'd be like, no, like you can't go do that. So there are ways you can apply a lot of these types of like intentional listening like this, like we call it community engagement, but really it's just like being a good reporter is like being a good listener, being intentional about building relationships, building trust, building your source, and allowing that to kind of help guide you in as you go about reporting. You can frame it that way. Like, I just need some time to just like really dig in and do some intentional listening. Can I get a week? Can I get 2 weeks where I don't have to do daily news? And I'll report back to you like what I learned, or whatever it is.
I'm going to argue that it's a really good role for editors too. Like I mean, I've sort of taken it on in my newsroom, even though like, I'm sort of like way far away from the ground reporting, but I, like Shane and I together have done all of the listening and turned that into assignments and baked that into our sort of like where we get our story ideas from. Because I was thinking about what Brittany said about, you get all this great, your audience is telling you what they want to know, and you still have to sort of pitch that to your reporters where you're like, is anybody interested in this? Because we have overwhelming evidence that this is all people care about. And I'm shocked sometimes how hard a sell that is. And Shane and I have been working really hard at like turning those into actual assignments. I mean, we've never been the kind of newsroom that like does a lot of like direct assigning, but now it's just like, listen, we know this is what people care about. This is all they're talking about. Like, go do it for the love of God, like bring the people what they are asking for. So I do think like it's awesome. If I had a reporter who was like, I'm doing this on my own, I would be all for it. But I also feel pretty responsible as a manager and as an editor to kind of do that for them.
I love that. And oh, sorry, Lisa.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I love that. And I love that you're prioritizing and making space for it and taking the leadership on it. The only thing I was going to add as far as like covering it as a small newsroom is that the nice thing about engagement is that you can take your time. And you don't have to start like completely from scratch. As a journalist and as someone who is present in your community, you probably have a good idea of like what a couple of the like big issues are, whether that's like people are really concerned about education in your community, or people are really concerned about housing, like everyone's really concerned about housing right now. You can set up like a nice long timeline that works for you. So you don't have to be like, we're having a listening session tomorrow for a quick turn story because we know this issue is like breaking news. Engagement doesn't necessarily work super well for breaking news unless you've gotten a really good framework that you've already set up and a bank of contacts that you've really like developed a good relationship with. So if you think of a project, give yourself like a nice long generous timeline that you can make work with what you're doing, and just kind of integrate it into your work. That way you don't want this to be onerous. You basically want to bake it in and start making it part of your workflow. But you don't have to do that like right away. Like, you can give yourself grace to to learn and to have a longer timeline.
Well, yeah, if your editor gives you grace, if your boss gives you grace, right? I just want to get Jessica Maria Ross's question out there. Sorry, Jill, we're out of time, and most people only book about an hour for this. JMR wants to know how you report back to those who attended the listening sessions and their constituencies. How do you, what's the full circle on your engagement? What's your process for that?
Create an email list and send them all the story.
Yeah, we collect like contact information sort of at the outset of the session, especially because if people want to share contact information with each other, which happens a lot also, if they have like shared experiences. So we have that, and we sort of have in that Airtable that I mentioned before, we've had sort of like an ongoing like email list to distribute stories when we've done a story that could be of interest to people that we've talked to.
Yep, same for us. Anybody we contacted for the listening session, whether they said yes or no, like we send it back to them to be like, this is the stuff that came out of what you told us.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you guys. This was great. A lot of it was, stuff we knew and stuff we heard about, but to hear how you're doing it and how it's worked and how it's paid off has been really wonderful. So thank you so much. We put handouts in the chat. They'll also be on our website. A recording of this will be on our website. So if you're new climate reporter, for instance, didn't get a chance to listen in, or anybody else in your newsroom that you think might value this, please, share the link and share it out. This has been great. Thank you so much. And also I'll share their contact info. So if you want to reach out with personal questions, individual questions, I'm sure they'd be willing to talk to you. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Lisa. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Nice meeting everyone. Thank you.